This is a poem that I'm going to begin this reading with because I think that it's appropriate that I read it, especially in the company of Rachel, who I know would appreciate a poem about Saks Fifth Avenue. So this is called Saks Fifth Avenue Ground Floor. He's the only male circling awkwardly the well-lit perimeters of the cosmetic department. Into this estrogen canyon he meanders, past slinky women heavily adorned under their own products, like it was opening night at the opera instead of 10 a.m. on Wednesday. Stops in front of the Chanel counter. The middle-aged woman working there blinks, mauve-lidded eyes at him, signals a combination curiosity and bemusement, as if he's some lost child strayed from the distracted mother's hand. In sotto voce, he surrenders himself to her expert counsel. The exact lipstick, please, she used to wear, in faint hopes that the possession of this talismanic tube might compel her lips back to his. Chasm of silence opens between them. The saleswoman nibbles softly her lower magenta lip in sympathy, but also recognizes a shipwrecked castaway off his island, inquires gently, "Honey, wouldn't you be better off with a jar of our vanishing cream?"
I love it. Amazing. Also, I don't think we actually officially introduced you, even though you're a recurring guest before we start recording. So hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of I Like to Read with me, your host, Rachel Polanski, and esteemed poet, author, scholar, professor, man of many trades, Tony Magistrale.
Goatee.
That's the facial hair we're dealing with today. I don't remember. The last time I believe it may have been slightly different.
Maybe.
I think it was maybe more like a beard, more of a beard, like filled in a little bit more.
What could it be?
But beautiful opening imagery and poem. So I read this entire, by the way, we're talking about More Fun Than Pretty, your new collection of poetry. Some beautiful lines. I mean, into this estrogen canyon he meanders. I mean, beautiful imagery. Really, I mean, I'm assuming, was this written from a personal perspective? Did you have an actual moment where this?
The story behind this poem, Rachel, is that, and I should have told you this before I read it. I was in Saks one day looking at watches because I'm a big watch person, and I saw this guy who kept circling around the cosmetics department, and he looked lost.
As many men do in that department. Yes,
absolutely, because there are some real sharks in the water that are floating there on high heels.
Oh yes.
And I just looked at him, and I was wondering what he was doing. So I kind of, I'm a bit of a people watcher, so I just watched his trajectory as he moved around and just kind of looked at stuff. It just looked lost, and that's where the origins of the poem began. Just standing there, watching this guy in the middle of this. Well, you know what Saks is like downtown in Manhattan.
Yeah, it's really like a microcosm in itself. It's more than just a department store. You know, it's not like walking into even Macy's or anything. It really has that high level elevation.
So that's where a lot of my poems begin, with speculation. They're sometimes they're based primarily in what if. I ask the question, what if? And my question for this guy might have been, what if you were to go and talk to one of these women behind the counter and ask for a product? And I kept thinking, well, okay, so what can I do with that? And then gradually it came to me that this guy was lost because he was bereft. And I said, okay, so that's what we're going to have him. That's what we're going to have him do. You know, in some ways, if poems for me are like writing a novel, a small novel. You know, I've got a character, and I want to develop that character. I want to see what happens to him. In some ways, the character sometimes has embodiments that are similar to me. In other ways, it's just a fantasy creation. Right. I'm sure he was not looking for his girlfriend's lipstick,
but he may have been.
But in my poem,
or metaphorically, he was looking for something for. I wrote down. You take a full story or a vignette and you make magic out of the mundane, and I think that was a really cool. You made these little instances come alive. Like for anyone else, it would just be another person at the cosmetic counter, and for you, again, because you're a people watcher, because you're such an astute observer, you take this moment and you make it come alive.
What a nice thing to say, Rach. Thanks. It's really sweet.
The book it's a slim volume of poetry, but there's a lot in here. I literally dog-eared or underlined, most. And even if I didn't know you and didn't have the bias going in, because I've heard you read poetry a couple of times before, back when I was one of your students at the University of Vermont, which recurring listeners will know. And so I love poetry, and I haven't really delved into an actual volume of poetry by the same author in a long time. So if you want to dazzle us with your next poem, maybe if you have another one that you want to go for, and then I'll pick your brain on that one.
Since I took you to New York City with that last poem, I'm going to take you to Amsterdam, Netherlands.
Oh, yes, across the pond.
This is one of my favorite poems in this collection. I spent a lot of time in the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam, looking at especially the spring paintings that he produced. And I was there for a while with my son, who was living in Amsterdam at the time, and we were able to look at some of the paintings together, which was really fun to talk to him about several of these. But for some reason, this particular poem, this particular painting, The Potato Eaters, drew my attention. And I sat down in the museum while he was off, probably in a cafe somewhere. But I was still in the museum. So I sat down I was right in front of The Potato Eaters, which is where the final images of this poem come from. Huh. So it's called Vincent, and it was actually written in the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam. To view your legacy in Amsterdam requires an 18 euro ticket purchased online with a credit card at least one day in advance. You never cared much about popular acclaim, so long as Theo and for a while Gauguin were simpatico with your explorations. That paint contained always more than just color, that an artist is merely a link in a chain, that God's hand worked surreptitiously through your own. I wonder how you would feel about sower affixed to plastic coffee mugs and sunflowers on the sides of thousands of totes. What would you say to the beefy guards patrolling the museum named after you, who insist children visiting your paintings must keep their hands at least 5 feet away? How would you reconcile your monstrous fame with the memory of 1,000 cuts and rejections? This far north, the light still lingers late in summer, and peach blossoms riot just as brightly every spring, especially in this part of the world, where everything you envisioned and bore into paint has been funneled into a global economy, where descendants of the same street urchins who mocked you, who thought you mad, who spurned your efforts, sigh in homage to the lemon yellow imaginings, stand in long queues to gain 5 minutes in the presence of the potato eaters and the silver steam that ascends above their humble meal. Now, I don't think I could have written this if I hadn't been close to this painting, because if you look carefully at it, you'll see that steam that's rising from the meal that they're about to have. And that's where that last line found its way in, because it was that steam that's coming up that suddenly caught my attention and made me say, this is the genius of this painter.
Right. I didn't even notice it on first look either.
It's one thing to create these characters. It's one thing to create these very visual pedestrian workers under a light, engaged in a supper. But it's another thing to get that steam. And it's the steam that stayed with me more than anything.
Yeah, the steam. I mean, it's also in the shadow of another person too. The steam is, being almost around the woman who is maybe cooking it, or we don't get to see her face either. Or, I think it's a woman.
A child. I think it's
a child. Yeah, even a young. Yeah, someone.
Yeah, I think it's a child. The use of the Van Gogh's use of lights and darks in this painting, really, really spectacular. Shows a great skill, especially since this is coming really before his great period in the 1890s. This is still relatively early.
The first half of the poem also kind of made me think of the Don McLean song Vincent, and how it was sort of, taking a poetic look into his life and, how you suffered for your sanity. That sort of, I felt a little bit of that inspiration there. Whether it was
absolutely. I
love that song.
That definitely found its way in here because it was, let's face it, anytime anyone talks about Van Gogh, you've got to bring up the fact that this is somebody who created this incredibly beautiful art, this incredibly beautiful oeuvre, and who suffered so deeply, in isolation and in rejection. And that's why I came up with those lines about the 1,000 pictures of the sower on the totes.
Right. And that kind of goes back to your Edgar Allan Poe conversation also that we had last time with the commodification of the image and sort of separating the, now we're just buying pictures of Van Gogh, and it's like coming full circle because that's not necessarily his intention, but hey, it is.
and it's an interesting serendipity too, Rachel, insofar as Van Gogh knew Poe's work.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, he had read Poe, as any good Frenchman would have done by the 1880s.
Was it what was the guy's name? The Flaneur, right? That was the French,
Flaneur.
Right? Yeah, I'm like,
right. Baudelaire and the Flaneur.
Baudelaire, yes.
That's right.
I think that one too. I mean, how many of these poems come, directly from a specific setting or place versus sort of like an inspiration that comes just if you're, sitting at your desk and working on something, how does the inspiration strike you beyond just, observing a particularly, magical moment?
Well, I'm going to be honest with you, Rachel. The writing of this poem took actually weeks.
Wow, okay.
Because it goes through these drafts, where you're sitting there thinking about this and especially when you're in front of the painting and you want to do something that's going to connect to the painting. And what came first was my attitude. My attitude was not good about the Van Gogh Museum because so much of what has become part of the Van Gogh legacy is this process that you have to undergo to get into the museum. You have to buy the ticket the day in advance before you go. You can only use a credit card to do it. And my credit card was already filled up. So
this is pre-COVID, right? So it's not even like that these were, because of certain health measures or anything.
Absolutely. This is pre-COVID. So there's all this bureaucracy surrounding it and all these beefy guards moving around, getting in your way when you're trying to get close to these paintings. And, it's almost like I almost felt like saying, why don't you just stop and let people enjoy this?
Yeah.
And just leave us alone instead of making this all about you and all about this institution that you've created. So that's where the poem had its origins, with me being pissed off. And that was the first half of the poem. And then gradually what was happening is I began to realize that this was not worth enough energy. What I really wanted to do more than anything was get into the actual museum itself. So then I started to move into Van Gogh's world. And that's where it ended up, which is a far better place than where it started.
How did it become sort of, because I'm not super familiar with his like legacy in terms of how did the museum like get started and how, I'm assuming this wasn't necessarily his wish, but when you have someone who's such a famous artist and it's been so long, I mean, can you explain a little bit more about the history and sort of like how that came to be?
It's a convoluted history. I mean, mostly these paintings were collected by Van Gogh's brother, who followed him into the grave less than a year later. And then they were collected, and I forget, one of his relatives, I think, held onto these paintings, and they began to realize that this was worth something, especially when Van Gogh's skills began to be appreciated more extensively by the art world. And as that happened, I'm sort of losing color here. Sorry.
That's okay.
And as that happened, I think the relatives of Van Gogh began to set up a trust that eventually became the museum.
Okay.
Van Gogh Museum. So it was a combination of the trust that was set up with all of these paintings in it, because literally there are thousands of Van Gogh paintings. It's amazing. There was a year in the early part of the 1890s where Van Gogh did essentially a painting a day.
Wow, I didn't know that. That's crazy.
Yeah, it was just phenomenal output.
And those were all saved and those are archived. They're not like lost anywhere for the most part.
Most of them are in the archives of this museum. This museum's just loaded with his work, as you well can imagine. But if you notice, when you go to any museum anywhere, there's always at least one or two Van Goghs in it.
Yeah, that's true.
I mean, he's just everywhere. He's been disseminated all across the world, which is as it should be.
And if he's not there with one of his paintings, then you bet there's at least some sort of Starry Night or Van Gogh plush with missing an ear or something in the gift shop, if he's not in the museum directly.
Well, a lot of these paintings, like Starry Night, for example, these were purchased before there was this trust and before there was this museum. This museum's not that old. This museum's probably only about 70 years old.
Interesting. Okay.
At the most. So that you had people going abroad. There were, I'm trying to think of were the Clark brothers, for instance, I think they were from Massachusetts, who went abroad and bought all of these paintings from French Impressionists. And because of their largesse, they were able to bring it to America. That's why America has maybe the best collection of French Impressionism, even better than France.
Wow. Okay. I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's really important, really, really interesting how all that happened. But there's a museum in Massachusetts called the Clark Museum that has.
Yeah, it sounds vaguely. I mean, I grew up in Massachusetts, but didn't appreciate a lot of the art in the museums. Now I can. Yes, the Clark, is that in Worcester, like at Clark University?
That's where it is.
Gotcha. Okay.
That's where it is. It's in Worcester.
Yeah, that's part of the reason why is because I'm from more like Boston area, and Worcester's a little more far, but a little farther. But for me, it's like the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum too, as it always sticks out. And that's one that I did appreciate, at least at a young age, because how could you not? I mean, it's crazy what they do there, and I love the keeping up of the empty frames. That is like a wild story. There's a poem for you. That's almost like a novella.
Well, the whole place is a poem. I mean, it's like you're inside a Venetian house, literally.
Right. And it's literally like by Fenway Park too, which is just crazy. And they've like built up the area around it. Cause of course at the time it was more like countryside. And now there's, like a Blick art store and a movie theater. I mean, it's just in the middle of the city.
One of these days, get to the Clark Museum.
The Clark Museum. Okay. So they have some of his works there.
I don't know if they've got any Van Goghs, but they've got some amazing
French Impressionist paintings.
I've not been there. I don't know the Clark Museum. I want to go there. That's my next road trip is the Clark.
Not too far from Vermont. You can get there a little easier than Los Angeles, but
that's right.
I'm sure we've got some cool stuff around here, in the city, but maybe not as a little different than Massachusetts. the energy is different at the museums here, but that's a whole other conversation and
I'm sure.
topic in itself. So a lot of your poems, you speak directly to these artists, whether it's Van Gogh or Picasso, but then we do Mick Jagger and we go into a little more contemporary. So again, are those more of like a personal instance that struck you how do you decide who to investigate and who to explore? Because, the world of celebrities and famous people are so fascinating, but, I feel like there's a specificity to your choices, if you want to talk a little more about that.
A lot of times, Rach, they select me. I've been such a fan of Stairway to Heaven for so many years. And I've always wondered what that song's really about. Because I don't trust when Plant and Page do explanations of how this came about. So I guess I was tempted to figure out my own explanation for Stairway to Heaven, which led to that poem. Maybe that's a good one to read.
Yeah, let's go there.
Okay.
That's towards the end, right?
I think so.
Yeah. Yeah. Page 65.
66.
66. Yes.
Got it.
66. Yes. Yeah. Right.
Okay. So again, this is one of those poems that took a long time to finally get made and into this shape. I kept working on it, and I went to see Led Zeppelin when they were on the American tour in 1976.
Oh my God, that must have been amazing.
It was amazing. It was just after they'd released the collection that included Stairway to Heaven. I forget, Houses of the Holy maybe was when they were coming out. I think that was the album before that. But my girlfriend got us tickets, and so
probably no idea what you're getting into too at the time.
Well, I pretty much knew, but
you knew, yeah. You knew, but
she complicated it by bringing psychedelic.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. You knew, but as the poem tells us, maybe you didn't know the full extent.
Yeah, well, at one point, I remember as we were walking into the auditorium in Buffalo, there's a big concrete ramp that you have to walk up, and I saw it suddenly start to slam. And I knew something was happening to me.
The beginning of the trip, yes.
So this is called Stairway, and it brings me back to my misspent youth, but it also continues on to all the other times that I've heard this song over the years on classic rock radio. We ate psychedelic mushrooms an hour prior to the show and found ourselves peaking at the moment of Page's opening guitar chords. I haven't dropped psychedelic mushrooms since, but those first notes take me back there every time. The steady buildup of that rock anthem, like the measured foreplay of a deliberate lover, Plant's voice starting out so low, so slow, climbing its own tonal staircase, leaving the ground, the very earth to which the rest of us remain tethered, rising skyward like Icarus must have felt amid the cries of multi-hued birds, so high, closing in on the sun's heat, while on the street below, glittering in a gold lame dress, a platinum-haired lady about the same age as Plant checks the time on her Rolex, taps the toe of her Louboutin against concrete, and waits impatiently for the stores to reopen.
I love it.
She's finding her way back to heaven. So here's a poem I'm going to read to you, Rach, that it's a real Vermont poem. I don't know how bad the mosquito population is out where you are.
It's not as bad, but they find me no matter what. So I am a victim of it wherever I am.
Well, here they're hideous.
Yeah.
They're just hideous. I mean, they're so big.
Well, it's muggy in a way on the East Coast that it's not on the West Coast.
That's right.
It's
I figured
gross.
Rach, before I go any further, let me say something about some of the paintings that are in
Yeah.
I have a very good friend of mine named Michael Strauss, who used to teach at the University of Vermont. He was a chemist and he taught chemistry at UVM. But his real skill and his real calling is as an artist.
So he painted this cover?
Yep, he did. Awesome. And in fact, if you look at the paintings, all the paintings in here that are not categorized in museums are
like
all
this
his.
one.
Like him, that one's his too.
This is like David Lynch, almost like a Mulholland Drive type of vibe, or it's the birds, but similar.
Exactly. So he did that. He did this painting of a mosquito, and he did it for this collection. And fortunately, he was kind enough to read this collection before it came into print, and he came up with a lot of paintings.
Okay, so he came up with them himself. Like, he read the book of poetry and then just sort of selected the ones that he felt would make good matches with paintings?
That's right.
Wow, that's cool.
Right. So this one's called Blood Simple. It lands on my hand. Out of a blur begins an exploratory dance and decides to assume residency. I brush at it, half-heartedly, because I'm busy reading. And it eludes the sweep of my distracted wave, gaining a reprieve to siphon vital fluids elsewhere. Instead, it chooses not to fly away, hovers magnetically close and descends again. Same hand, a mere 3 inches from where we were introduced. This time, book tabled, its lights out. A seriousness of purpose which my other hand delivers with brutal finality. I study the crumpled wreck in aftermath, legs tripoded out in broken stance, unsatisfied proboscis crooked at 90 degrees. My minuscule vampire resembles more a 3 a.m. drunk than the aerodynamic irritant of summer bogs and evening concerts. Cast out of love's garden, we share with the mosquito the urge to linger longer, trapped by the death trance, the aromatic mammalian scent, the archaic blood pulse that drives us, to bite again the hand that feeds, even as the other rises to kill.
I mean, yeah, as someone who has been victimized by mosquitoes many times, I especially resonate to this. I love that my minuscule vampire, because it's also, my minuscule vampire, because they take the blood from their host too. So it's like different, they do form this weird, like intimate bond with you that you don't really think about. This little bug is flying around with your DNA and your blood.
And of course, what was happening as I was writing this poem was, as I was working the mosquito, I began to see it in connection to the loss of love, to the breakup of a relationship, and the way in which the mosquito forms this bond with you, and then and eventually it dies.
Yeah, it's like a symbiotic parasite, and then it becomes, at some point the host, can only take so much, or you only have so much blood to give, and you only have so many resources. But it's different also than a leech in a sense, because I feel like leech is, the mosquito, it's doing its job, but I'm like, and then I have a welt after, but yeah. So
and an itch.
Yeah. And I think back to his paintings too, like each one kind of has such a different style too, which I think is, you can tell almost, that they're by the same author. You get a sense of his style, but they're all very, I don't even know how to describe, like this one is very beautiful, like the watercolor and the way that he captures, I think, the human form and makes it sort of ethereal and beautiful in a way that's grounded without them being sort of like, actual deities or gods. He elevates the human form in a really cool way.
Mike is a great painter. And he started off doing watercolors, and mostly watercolors of landscapes, which are fine.
Right.
Don't get me wrong, they're pretty. But he went away to Italy for about 6 months. He and his wife went to Italy, and he discovered color. And he started painting in acrylics.
So is that what he uses to make these?
Yeah. Most of these are acrylics. And I think what happened as he was discovering his color, as he was discovering, just form.
Yeah.
He moved away from the landscape work, which is very attractive and very Vermontish, but kind of devoid of any real energy in order to create paintings like the cover.
Yeah, these are really, they're also clearly, something about your poetry spoke to him, and it's his interpretation of it too, rather than you commissioning them for him, it's his interpretation of the work. And I think that's really, it's also nice to see how, which ones he felt spoke to him and which ones he felt needed a painting, because not all of them have them. And I don't think all of them need them, but the way that he matches certain ones are really, really special.
Well, one that I'm kind of fond of is on page 28 and 29. And Mike responded to this poem with this great image of a woman descending from a car.
This one's almost it's almost like, if you, on first glance, it looks like it could be like a photograph or something, like if you're not looking too close to the edges.
That's right. That's right. And I love the image that he's got there, because this is exactly what I had in mind when I wrote this. What I'm going to miss. What I'm going to miss were those silky exits from the back seat of an Uber, wearing one of those bandage dresses that rose high and tight along her thighs, the air that went limp as a sigh once she decanted and entered the pulse of a neighborhood, its movement abruptly still as an oil painting. As strangers retain their breaths long enough to savor her arrival, reorient their coordinates, while she walked along nonplussed by her ability to alter the magnetic field of an entire city block. What I'm not going to miss is having these poems circle back to her as their subject. Echoes from an extinct world, ghostly residues of a vanished respondent. The ease with which beautiful women move on without us.
Yeah, I loved that last paragraph, especially it's having all my poems circle back to her as their subject, because I've dabbled in poetry myself as well. I haven't written a few for a while, but I remember, certain points of my life too, especially I'm like, I'm definitely, when I had a relationship with somebody or a particular, muse for whatever reason, I definitely am not going to miss. And then I look back at them and I read them, and it's sort of, my own sort of what I'm not going to miss, because I read certain things I think that were important for a certain period of time in my life. And then when you reflect on them later, you realize that there's a lot of things you're not going to miss that you thought you would.
That's right. And that's what this poem's doing. It's going both ways. It's saying, look, these were great moments that you inspired. But at the same time, I paid a price for that inspiration.
Right. And they were just moments too. I think it's more than, you inspired moments, but you didn't, I also had agency over that time as well, I think too, which is important to remember, because we often, I think with particularly important relationships or moments with periods with certain people in our lives, like we feel like they had all the agency in that moment, but we also had agency more than just interpreting it. You made choices too.
Absolutely.
Good or bad, which
it's all about choices, isn't it?
Yeah.
In the end, it's always about choices. And some are missed opportunities.
Right. I mean, I don't know. Have you seen the film that came out a couple months ago, Everything Everywhere All at Once?
No.
Have you heard about? Oh, that's a fascinating film. It takes the idea of, you live in one universe, but every choice that you've made stems into another universe. And what if you had the power to access those different selves and those different universes? And what if you could look back at your life and see the chances that you had and how the different paths led you to there? And it's with Michelle Yeoh. She's the main actor in it. So if you get a chance to check it out, I think it's still in theaters.
I like her.
Fascinating. She's fascinating. It's also, it talks a lot about the Asian American immigrant family experience and different generational trauma. But it's a really crazy, wild, it's hard to describe, but I think it was one of the best films I've seen this year. So definitely
Give
if
me
you
the
get a
name
chance.
again.
Everything, Everywhere, All at Once. And you'll appreciate this too. So the little kid who played Short Round in Indiana Jones, he is her husband.
Oh,
And they literally found him. He hasn't even acted in anything in like 20 or 25 years. He went on, he was in the Goonies, he was in Indiana Jones, and then he went on to be more of like an AD stunt director. And then the guys who directed this film were like, hey, what happened to Short Round? And they looked him up and they're like, hey, be in our movie. So it has all these fun little Easter eggs and connections to
nice.
talk about choices. Yeah, I think you'll really enjoy it.
I will. I'll definitely check it out. Thank you.
Yeah. So while we're reaching towards the end of our hour, but we still have some time, I want to talk about New Year's Eve on Church Street, because as a college student, this was a very poignant poem. And before we read it, I wanted to ask, what is it like to live? I mean, you don't directly live in Burlington, but you're constantly surrounded by college students and these people who are going through, I think about those 4 years of my life, and there was a lot of transformative, crazy experiences, but you're kind of staying the same in a way. Like, you're still getting older. You're going, we all get older, years go by, but you're not going through this transformative stage in the way that they are. So what is it like to experience that and live in that world beyond the way that you put in the poems? Is there a way to describe that you can kind of talk about right now? I know that's probably
I'm going
a lot,
through some of my own transitions here. I'm coming to the end of a career. I'm coming to the end of 40 years of teaching at the university.
Wow, 40 years. Dang, wow.
And it's been an interesting ride. I mean, I've got a lot of course, reflections on all of that. But let's go to the question that you asked. What's it like being around all these young people at this point in my life? I always felt very much in tune with my students. I always felt like we had a great deal in common. I'm starting to feel less of that. I'm starting to feel I'm more conscious of the gap that separates me from them. And I suppose it's a gap that exists for a lot of reasons. First of all, it's a technological gap.
I mean, TikTok, like
it's
you
a
don't
huge technological gap. And I don't think that that's very good or very healthy.
No.
I'm very distressed at what I see to be the heavy reliance on both the parts of the institution as well as my students on technology, as though this is where their future is.
Right.
And that scares me a lot, because I see a lot of very depressed and anxious people who are glued to screens.
Uh-huh.
And I'm very concerned about that, because I think it's wrecking not only our culture, but also our abilities to communicate with one another.
Totally agree.
And it's one of the reasons why there's so much stress and anxiety among young people right now, because of technology. And no one will admit this. No one will step forward and say, this technology is not a miracle, it's a curse.
Well, because they're like, look at all the good it's doing, but without the good doesn't come without the bad. And I completely agree with everything you're saying.
Let me be clear here. I'm not a Luddite.
No, but there's a difference. But, you understand the benefits of it, but also, you have lived your life without technology being there for a large part of it. And I think you'd be fine with that. But you've also adapted to a point where I think you've adjusted. We're on a computer right now. We wouldn't be able to have this conversation if we didn't have Zoom and this technology. So it's definitely helpful. But I mean, you're not going to then spend the rest of your day on this computer. You have you're going to go be removed from technology. Unfortunately, I will probably be spending a lot more of my day on the computer, and that's not fun, but that's just, I work remotely and that's what I have to do.
Well, I think a lot of things happen. When you're in the state that I think our students are. When you've asked me about how I relate to our students, a lot of times I don't. Like I remember this past winter, I got on one of those shuttle buses at the university.
Yep.
And
as
soon as I got on the shuttle bus, I looked at all the students and everyone had their head down and they were all scrolling. And I turned to the bus driver and I said, I could get on this bus naked and no one would notice. Right. And the bus driver turned to me and he said, I'd notice. And I said, and that's why I've got clothes on.
Right. Because as long as there's one person noticing, we'll have a little bit less societal deviance,
Yeah.
but at some point, yeah. No,
But
that's
it was also the way he said it too, Rachel. It was like, I notice, like, don't fuck with me.
Right. He's like, I already have to deal with these annoying little shits, and now I'm gonna have to deal with a naked professor. Like, no. He's like, that's the last thing I need.
I just think there's something very disturbing about watching the interactions that the lack of interaction that happens when somebody is glued to a screen, and what they're missing.
Yeah.
The air. What even if it's the middle of winter, you're missing the middle of winter. You're missing the shit-stained window because of all the crap that's the snow's turned into. You're missing just the experience of who's on the bus with you.
Right. There could be a random naked man.
A naked guy could be on the bus with you, and you wouldn't notice.
Maybe that's why there aren't any naked men, because they wanted the attention, and now they know that no one's noticing. So they're kind of like, yeah, fuck it.
Might as well keep my clothes on and not catch cold.
Right. That's a really good point. I mean, speaking of, back to Stairway to Heaven, I actually went to a Judas Priest concert a few months ago, and I almost had an anxiety attack because everyone was on their phone filming it. And I'm guilty of being on my phone a lot, but I feel like when I'm out, usually I'm on my phone a lot, but when I'm home and not doing anything, when I'm out, I try to experience things as much as possible. And I was like, these men have been singing for over 50 years and committed their lives to the craft. And if you're here filming the entire concert on your phone, what is the point of even being there in person and experiencing it? I get if you want to film the 30 seconds where he comes out on the motorcycle and show that to all your friends, that's cool. But if, even filming an entire song, that it's going to be put up on YouTube. I just, even if you're there, I think having this barrier, and that's why, I mean, as great as it is to have these conversations over Zoom, I mean, that is the one thing. If we were in person, I just feel like there's a level, you're great. And because you talk all the time, but there are certain people where I feel like I've talked to you, even if it's just a regular meeting. And I'm like, we just don't have that dynamic in-person interaction. And so if you're experiencing everything through a screen, even if you're in person, what's next? Are people, I've heard stories of Broadway shows where historically, you couldn't bring your phone out at all. And people are just screw it. And it's just what is our job? And I'm guilty of so many of these things, and I'm still frustrated at it. So I'm like, are enough people my age just not frustrated at it and just not caring? I mean, clearly not, because 90% of them had their phones out at Judas Priest. But I was just like, it's really, so just know that you're not alone. I feel the same way too. I feel disconnected at times from people my own age and from people who are even 10 years younger, because I'm 28 now. So the 18-year-olds are a whole other species.
Well, those are the momentary frustrations that I sometimes feel, and the momentary sense of distance. But there's another factor here that also troubles me even deeper. And that's that the students who are at UVM, the students I'm teaching now, while as bright as any group of students I've ever had before, they're just wonderful. They've always been wonderful students, your class included. There's a problem in the sense that they think technology is going to be the answer to everything.
Yeah.
This is the future. And it's not just them, it's their parents, and it's the institution that's teaching them technology is going to solve all of our problems. And no one is saying, what about the problems that technology are going to create?
Right. That's a really good perspective. Do you even get any papers in actual paper anymore, or is everything online?
I make them give me actual papers.
Because that's one thing too. I mean, marking up something, and that's why I loved, your books I'll buy in person, despite reading 95% of my stuff on my Kindle. Because I'm like, I want to mark these up. I want to do that. And yeah, you can have that functionality electronically, but it's not the same.
Yeah, it's not. It's not. I mean, I'm the same way. When I get a new book, I mark it up. I mean, that's the joy of owning a book.
And then you can dog ear. I mean, I know it's taboo for some people, but I like to dog ear. And then you can tell the book is telling a story too. And now this is my story with this book. I read it actually on a flight back from Boston to Los Angeles. So this traveled with me cross country. So the books themselves can have stories, and you don't get that when you just, your phone is the story. No.
I'm delighted that happened. That's just great that this was with you all the way from Boston to.
It actually went to Aruba with me. I went to Aruba with my family at the beginning of April, and that's why I was in Boston. So I brought this book to her. So it's an international traveler.
How wonderful! That's great. That's great. Well, look, we're almost out of time.
Yes.
So, did you have one that you'd like me to read?
Yeah. Let's see. You know what? Maybe because let's end with New Year's Eve on Church Street, because sure. I think I'm at both ends of the spectrum where I started out. I mean, no, let's be real. I'm not an old. I'm 28. I'm not like, super jaded, older, 90-year-old sitting there. But I've been on both ends of the spectrum where now I'm asking the questions of, yes, how are we going to solve the problems that technology is causing, rather than like technology will solve everything.
What page is this? Rach?
7.
7. I'm going at the other end of the book.
And I wrote the bittersweet nostalgia beyond words, which is kind of how I feel about my college experience and why I need to go back. But let's hear your
okay.
Your words.
New Year's Eve on Church Street. For your listeners out there who have never visited Burlington, Vermont, Church Street is a pedestrian passageway where there are no cars, and there are always people, even at the early hours of the evening, but especially on New Year's Eve.
Yes.
Wandering about. So New Year's Eve on Church Street. Ice-glazed streets filled mostly with young revelers, many in groups in search of parties, free alcohol. I walk the streets attentive to faces, searching for something I have lost but cannot name. Those who encounter me directly show the goodwill of the season. One woman, drunk, her stocking torn, cries softly for the death of another year. The ruined makeup on her face marking her with dark smudges, raccoon eyes. Across the street, college students greet one another, and the freshly minted year with full-throttled glee. Hugs all around. It's nearly their time now, and they are eager to seize it. Their winter coats unzipped and open to the wind as snow crystals accumulate on their hatless heads.
Yeah.
In that poem, I wanted to show two contrasting worlds. I wanted to show the death of a year and the woman who was weeping. And I wanted to show the anticipation of a new year with the kids with their coats unzipped and no hats on their heads.
Or they would just wear like shorts and a t-shirt. I'm like, it is negative degrees out. What are you doing?
Yeah, I didn't want to make any kind of judgments. I simply wanted to record. I wanted to let the images record and let the reader make the judgments on what I was showing. I wanted to show the woman, with the ripped stocking and the tears to be associated with the year that has passed, another year. And especially the older you get, Rachel, I think the more you look at New Year's Eve as a sense of loss.
Yeah.
It's the end of a year. It's the end of another New Year's Eve. So many of these I've experienced, and you were accumulating your own set of them.
Right, and all those choices too that you could have made, back to
That's
that.
right.
Like, it's a time for reflection. And well, man, if I had only done this or that, would I be different? Would it be a different outcome? It would still be the new year, but would I be in a different mental headspace or even physical space, depending on a certain choice? Who knows? So
there's some sadness there in that process. But there's also that group that's over there glad to see each other. They're
right. Like, another year, it's an excitement. It's a celebration.
It's forward. It's looking forward. So right. I wanted to do both. I wanted to capture both the loss of the new year, of the old year, and the anticipation of a new one. So, and I didn't want to make any judgments. I just wanted to give kind of verbal portraits of these two phases of being.
Yeah, I think also for me too, as someone who grew up as a college student in Burlington, I kind of felt both sides of the coin. I mean, at times in my youth and when I was 20 or 19, I even felt like so wise beyond my years. And I was just like really upset or bitter about certain things. And looking back, it's so dumb, but I kind of felt like I was that woman too, where I was like something small, just sort of, oh my gosh, if this class has ruined this and this, whatever financial worries I wasn't paying bills and stuff like I am now, or just the relationship, it's just so different. But I think even as a young adult, if you read this as a college student, you can identify a little bit with that woman, but also knowing that she is more your future than the college, looking forward versus looking backwards.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think you're at 28 years old, you ought to be looking forward.
Right. I mean, I miss college, but I'm glad for, again, it's those choices and they led me to where I am now, and certain random circumstances, just, like taking Sarah Nielsen's history of television class, and that led indirectly to me being a film major.
Well, also, Rachel, you're going to have many, many more New Year's Eves, and
let's hope so. Yeah.
And they're going to be wonderful. I mean, you're going to have great moments and great memories of that.
And there'll be ripped stockings too, but I think it's just knowing that, you can always buy another pair of them.
Yeah.
Well, thank you as always. I think, is this your third time? Maybe third.
Okay.
Yeah. So you're our biggest recurring guest. So now you have to write something else so we can have you back on in the next 6 months or something.
Okay. That sounds good.
Well, thank you as always, Tony. And I will link your book below so people can check it out. More Fun Than Pretty, available now. And if you enjoyed these poems, which I'm sure you will, then check out a bunch more. And you have other books of poetry as well, right? This isn't your first one.
I forget, this is maybe the fourth one.
Okay. So if you enjoy this, then there's a lot more to check out. And if you enjoyed my conversation with Tony, we have a couple of conversations about Stephen King and Edgar Allan Poe. So we'll link those below. And until next time, stay reading.
Okay, Rich.
Bye.